Well, I don't know how many of you are familiar with Das Kapital, right? But if you look at Volume 1 of Kapital, he develops a whole concept of absolute surplus value and relative surplus value. Yeah? And absolute surplus value is historically associated with the earlier development of capitalism. You're talking about this separation, no, not separation, it's the wrong word, the split in the working day between that portion of the working day which is necessary labour and that portion of the day which is surplus labour. And surplus labour becomes, surplus value becomes profits. Okay? And he uses an example of a 12-hour day, split 6 hours necessary labour, which is returned in the form of wages back to the workers, and 6 hours, actually I think, let's take the example of 10 hours, it will be easier for my purposes, right? So I have a 10-hour day, and 5 hours is for, here you go, that's how you were doing film, I did this, right? Okay, so you've got a 10-hour day. So the rate of exploitation here, what's the rate of exploitation?
50%. 50%?
Well, in actual fact, it terms it 100%.
One.
Yeah.
One.
It's by maths.
No, it's okay. No, it depends what. There's a 100% because surplus labour over necessary labour, that's the rate of exploitation. Yeah, 100%. Okay, so how can you increase the rate of exploitation? Or rather, how can you increase surplus labour? And what Marx says, I mean, read it, right? It's a section on relative and absolute surplus value. He looks at different permutations of how you do this, how the capital does, it's not how you do it, I hope, right? Is you increase the length of the working day. Okay, so instead of 10 hours, it is 12 hours. So instead of 5 hours surplus labour, it's 7 hours surplus labour. The workers are more exhausted and so on, but their degree of exploitation goes up. Okay. The second way, Marx argues, Marx proves from studying capitalism, right? You can increase is by that was the first one, okay? Is by reducing necessary surplus labour. Okay, that's the second way. Yeah. Now this second way in Marx's Capital is achieved by increasing the productivity of labour, which he calls increasing relative surplus value. And he says we will leave to the realm of another book on wages the situation where this is reduced just by paying the workers less. Okay. And this he calls when wages are below the value of labour power. So this is reduced by labour becoming more productive. So the labour that goes into the bread, whatever else it is to feed the workers, and the commodities are cheaper. So it takes fewer commodities to reproduce the workers as workers. This is the way relative surplus value works, okay? And he, as I say, puts to one side or outside his analysis. It'll keep coming back in, it pushes itself back in, but analytically it's outside. The question of reducing this simply by paying the workers less, okay? Well, with imperialism, you can't put it outside the analysis without denying the reality. So this is exploitation. Reduce the wages paid to the workers below the value of labour power, below the value of European labour power, right? And you're increasing the degree of exploitation, right? Okay? And this is the pivot. I've been asked to wind up, so I will wind up here, right? This is the pivot to understanding the current phase of imperialism, is super exploitation in the global south. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, comrades, as you know, it's 20 years since the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union subsequently after. So the whole structure of imperialism in some ways began to change. There's been significant debates on the left as to whether imperialism really became an issue of the one superpower which emerged, or something wider. So the whole issue of Eastern Europe then re-emerged in a different light. Our next speaker in that context is Marco Boitson. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. After the first presentation, I have to say that I feel that I have a different agenda in what I prepared, and I'm coming at the question of imperialism in a different way and towards a different end. And my way of analysing it is more historical, and I'm interested in I'm interested in exploring what is there beyond American imperialism today that tends to get buried or overshadowed by the recent predominance or unipolarity of U.S. power in the world, and so I want to take a look at Russia, country that for the left remained in the shadows for a long time because it was the heartland of the Soviet Union, and what was actually going on within that state in its 250 million people, its 120 different nations, hasn't really been looked at, and what is going on since the collapse of the Soviet Union and the activities of the Russian state in its region is something that is really just being looked at today. So I want to take a look at Russia, but let me just preface my remarks with a couple of sort of analytical issues. One is I don't think that one can understand imperialism as a phenomenon in human history without including in one's analysis the absolutely indispensable role of the state. Insofar as imperialism typically takes place in a relationship that spans oceans, crosses state borders, involves conquest and domination of a violent kind, the organized power of the state is critical to the activities of private capital, exploiting new territories, new labor forces, new natural resources. Secondly, I tend to look at imperialism as something that characterizes the international relations of powerful states against weaker states and societies, stateless societies, over periods of time predating our latest capitalist period. So, if we look at the plunder of the Americas by Imperial Spain in the 15th, 16th century, or we look at the seizure of 3/4 of the territory of the globe by French and British and other European metropolitan states in the 19th century down to the 20th century. Or then if we look at the US model of imperialism, which has not involved the actual direct seizure and administration of other states, but striking a coercive arrangement with them whereby they give up to the United States control of their national security and foreign policy in exchange for opening their economies and their markets up to the penetration of American capital, and through that the process of imperialism works. If we look at all of those different historical periods, I ask myself, what do they all have in common that allows me, at least, and others, to characterize these as imperialisms, as instances of imperialism, of sustained exploitation of overseas territories with the employment of state power for the accumulation and repatriation of wealth from the weaker to the stronger. And my answer to that is that imperialism is a combination, is sort of like a combined instrument of both military and economic, political, and ideological and cultural domination. It's a certain kind of an instrument that includes all of those things. But what its purpose is in every case is the efficient extraction of wealth.